centuries would imply a cure worse than the disease. And that brings us to a most interesting detail. The work which we have cited here, The Five Wounds of Christ, was one of the two Rosmini books which were placed on the Index of Forbidden Books in 1849, 3 years after Our Lady's apparition at La Salette. Rosmini died in 1855, and in 87 the Holy Office Decree Post Obitum condemned 40 propositions taken from Rosmini's works. Well over 100 years later, Pope Paul VI would refer to Rosmini's works as prophetic, and Pope John Paul II would recall Rosmini's works in his own encyclical Fides et Ratio. And not without reason, for in the reading of Rosmini, in works written at about the same time the Blessed Mother was appearing to St. Catherine Labouré at the Rue de Bac, one discovers a virtual blueprint for the Second Vatican Council. Only on July 1st, 2001, was Antonio Rosmini rehabilitated by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. At about the same time Antonio Rosmini was gaining notoriety in the beautiful lake region of northern Italy, basically between 1830 and 1850, Dom Prosper Guéranger was beginning his life's work of restoring the great monastery of Salem and the sacred liturgy in France, both of which had fallen on hard times. The work of restoring the structure of the monastery would serve to be a far simpler task than restoring the beauty and majesty of the Divine Liturgy. But through his efforts, Guéranger, who died in 1875, became the father of what would come to be known as the liturgical movement. Dom Guéranger from France and Dom Rosmini from Italy both observed a breakdown of Catholic life in their lifetime and tried to find a remedy, one which they could be sure would work. The primary focus of both was a return to the sacraments, although Rosmini looked for an answer in a radically different way than did Guéranger. Rosmini looked to close the gap between the priest and the people by bringing them closer to the priest, and in the process the lines between the two became somewhat blurred. Guéranger's remedy was to reform the liturgy by returning to the splendor and majesty of the worship of the Church when the civilized world was Catholic, the Middle Ages. Guéranger was faced with a monumental challenge in his effort to reform the liturgy. In France, in the years following the Concordat, Catholic liturgy was in disarray. According to Dom Rousseau in his book on the liturgical movement of the 19th century, The Progress of the Liturgy, in dioceses such as Versailles and Beauvais, there were as many as 9 breviaries and missals in regular use. Some were written with a Jansenist or Gallican view, but all vied with one another in their originality and suggested changes to the Mass. And although the liturgical movement of Dom Guéranger spread gradually across the continent, in many cases it encountered considerable resistance. To cite but one example, in Germany, Karl Anton Winter, a professor at the universities of Ingolstadt and Landshut, even before 1820, introduced a proposal for a German Mass and ritual that drew many supporters. Their objective sounds familiar to us today, but was apparently a new idea to them. To simplify the Mass, to give it more of a social character, and to make it more intelligible and edifying. In England, the liturgical movement drew the attention of Pusey and Newman, who long before converting to Catholicism attempted to reinvigorate the Anglican liturgy through what became known as the ritualist movement. This little bit of the history of the liturgical movement may be helpful to those Catholics who previously had no idea of the tension that surrounds authentic liturgy. For there are always those attempting to preserve what works, and those who want to change it because they are confident they know better. But after what we have seen, one thing seems certain. The new Mass of Paul VI is not near as new as most of us were led to believe. That brings us to the beginning of the 20th century. In order that we might be able to put all of this information into a proper perspective, let me read to you 2 citations. The first of these is taken from the most recent issue of A Catholic Fortnightly, which claims to be the strongest voice in traditional Catholicism today. In a recent article opposing the agreement that was struck between Bishop Rangel of the Society of St. John Vianney in Campos, Brazil, and the Holy See, its editor writes, "Combating the errors of neo-modernists today is impossible without unequivocally admitting that the Council and its brainchild, the Novus Ordo Missae, were catastrophic prudential errors." Now let me read you another citation. He was convinced that the liturgy could be a helpful means of Christian restoration, provided the people were given the opportunity of truly participating in the Mass, at which they now only assist. Stressing the social character of the Holy Sacrifice, he strove to make assistance at Mass a community action. His chief concern was to unite the people as closely as possible with the priest. It pained him to see how those assisting at Mass were left to themselves, each one seeking his own edification in his own way. He was opposed to the singing of hymns or reciting the rosary during liturgical functions. He objected to anything that separated the people from the great action. He wanted everyone present to sing the ordinary. He favored a restoration of communion under both species. He looked down on private masses and thought that the Holy Sacrifice should be offered only when the people participate through sacramental communion. He thought public communal confessions should replace private ones. He advocated the suppression of priestly celibacy, held a dim view of veneration of Our Lady and the saints, spoke negatively regarding papal authority, popular devotions, and pilgrimages, and he advocated that the Mass be celebrated in the vernacular. While this may well sound as though it might have been said by any of a number of ultra-progressivist liturgical experts who threw his weight behind a radical Second Vatican Council, this information is taken from Dom Rousseau's The Progress of the Liturgy. And the he referred to here is J.B. Hirscher, a prominent theologian and one of the founders of the University of Tübingen, Cardinal Ratzinger's turf. These proposals suggested by Hirscher, however, were published in the 1820s, and though each of them would come to fruition after 1960, these ideas, which merely reiterate those of the Protestants and Jansenists before him, were hardly the brainchild of the Second Vatican Council. Hirscher died in 1865, 100 years before the Second Vatican Council ended. I realize we have presented here an abundance of historical minutiae, but if one is to understand the truth of the introduction of Pope Paul VI's Mass, then some of this history is essential. As becomes blatantly obvious, at the dawning of the 20th century, there was a polarization regarding the liturgy into two particular camps. Both camps recognized a crisis of faith in the Church that had resulted from two revolutions. First, the Protestant Revolution that directly attacked the Church, and second, the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, which attacked God himself. Both camps wished most sincerely to restore the Church. They just disagreed on the method. On the one hand were the progressivists, those who shared some or all of the thinking of Winter, Hirscher, Jansen, and in part Ross Meany and the progressivists who followed him. They pushed ever more strongly for the simplification of the Mass, for the Mass to be said in the vernacular, for the priest to turn and face the people, for communion under both species, for a married clergy, for less individualistic piety, which